Since the start of 2022, prices on PC parts have been coming down to a point where I would feel comfortable recommending someone go out and build a new PC, especially if they waited through what was the misery known as 2021. However, since coming to Japan, I have learnt a lot in the recent 2 weeks of being here, especially compared to Australia, which from what I talked to you guys on the Discord, Australia's situation is very similar to the US in terms of supply and prices on PC parts. However, Japan is a whole different beast altogether. So let's get on into the story of Tech Yes rocking up to Japan in the last 2 weeks and talk about all things tech related and a little bit of finance thrown in there. Never pay full price for Windows 10 or 11 again. With today's video sponsor, SCD Keys, you can get activated for as little as $15 using that coupon BFTYC. Links in description below. Welcome back to Tech Yes City, and in the last 2 weeks, I've had to jump through a lot of hurdles to get back to Japan. But one thing I've noticed is there is a huge contrast between this country and the country that I live in, Australia. And the biggest difference is inflation, which if you're in the US or the UK or Australia right now, inflation is definitely making headlines. And that's rightfully so, because there is so much of it in these 3 countries. However, coming to Japan, the first thing I noticed was there was very little, if any, inflation here. And since the last 2.5 years since I've been here, it really feels like a whole lot hasn't changed in pricing. And that's actually a really good thing if you're planning to come to Japan. And since the yen is actually very weak compared to the US dollar, the Australian dollar, and even the English pound, it's actually going to make for one of the cheapest holidays you'll ever have. And in fact, being in Japan, everything has been practically a fire sale in terms of prices. For instance, I picked up recently a LG C9 55-inch OLED for roughly a little over 500 USD. Now, it was used, but it was in pretty much new condition, and I was over the moon because that same OLED TV in Australia would cost me a minimum of 2,000 Aussie dollars. So there are some absolute bargains that you can get in Japan on a variety of products. But also when it comes to PC parts and the prices on used stuff, that's also quite cheap as well. Doing a recent parts hunt in the last video that we did here on the channel, I actually scored some pretty good deals, especially online with the convenience of not even having to go outside. And some of you guys did comment and say that I got a pretty good deal on a GTX 970, as well as a pretty good deal on an i7-3770. But when it comes to new parts, and all over the world, I'm sure this is still a thing, graphics card prices are still slightly elevated above MSRP. And in fact, I was in Tokyo because I had to exchange some money. I was going to do a parts hunt, but I was actually spending time with my son and I was exchanging money, but I did manage to quickly pop into a tech store and I did manage to see a 3070 Ti just a tad over MSRP. However, a lot of the other graphics cards were sitting up there at ridiculously high prices still. So when it comes to graphics cards, they are coming down in price, but it still feels like they're the only component within the tech space that is still overpriced compared to what you're getting for your money. Though at this stage, you may be wondering, why are the graphics card prices still high? And that's because the demand for PC gaming, I feel, is still extremely high. There's a lot of gamers that were waiting on the sidelines in 2021 that weren't prepared to pay those ridiculous prices. And if you're one of those people that did ride out those high prices and now you're getting a decent price on a graphics card, I salute you.
Everybody, welcome back to The Price is Right. Time to spin the wheel.
But with those gamers now coming through and also crypto mining still on the decline in terms of profitability, it does make my personal outlook of the cheapest time to get a graphics card being around that September mark, especially when we look at what is going on with the Federal Reserve in the USA. And that is, they're talking about taking $95 billion a month off the balance sheet, aka quantitative tightening. Now, this is going to be a bit of finance talk, but basically you can think of quantitative in the word when it's used with quantitative tightening or even quantitative easing. That's the opposite. And that's what they did, the Federal Reserve and actually governments all around the world. They did this in the last 2 years, and they were going heavy on this with quantitative easing. Basically think of the word quantitative as mass. So mass easing in that they were buying a lot of bonds, making the price of loans cheap for people to go borrow. Now, here's where we contrast this from Japan to the US, the UK, and Australia. And this is where I think the inflation isn't a problem in Japan, because giving out someone the threat of cheap money doesn't necessarily mean that there'll be a heap of cheap money borrowed and pushed out into the economy. And that's what I feel is exactly the case that has happened in Japan versus that of the US and Australia and the UK, where I feel like people in these three countries were like, hey, cheap money, it's never been this cheap. We're going to go borrow to oblivion. And actually in Australia, I got firsthand experience of this, seeing someone come into a computer store when I was there with a friend. One of my friends, he works at a computer store, and we were just talking about tech. And then this person came in with a MacBook, and they put the MacBook on the desk, and they started bragging about how they had, I think it was only 3 pay slips. They were unemployed before that, and they managed to get a $500,000 loan. And so when you've got the individual getting a $500,000 and that borrowed money, we relate to what in the banking scene known as money creation theory, they're creating $500,000 and then pushing that into the economy, which is highly inflationary in nature, especially when the interest repayments are very cheap and they don't have to pay back much money on that loan. So that's where I feel like in Australia, US, and UK, all this inflation has come from actually the consumer, where the governments and especially the central banks have given out the threat of inflation with cheap money and supplying that cheap money, but it's ultimately the consumer that's taken the reins and taken over and said, hey, we're going to make sure this inflation's real by borrowing that money into existence. And that's one thing that I have definitely learned coming to Japan and seeing firsthand, because if you guys didn't know, Japan is pretty much the king in the world of quantitative easing. The governments are constantly keeping the loans extremely cheap here, and they're constantly buying bonds. That's the Bank of Japan, or BOJ. So what this means is, even though, yes, they're keeping the money cheap in Japan and the government is still spending and creating a massive amount of debt, it's ultimately the consumer, the average person, that isn't borrowing money to oblivion and pumping it into the economy, creating massive inflation. So that was one thing that I really learned in my time here in the last 2 weeks, scratching my head about all these different theories that people have on money creation, as well as modern monetary theory that I've seen now firsthand, and where I pretty much relate that to what I think's going on. And one thing as a deal hunter, it's one thing that I'm personally very comfortable doing, and that is buying low and selling high. And I've done this with PC parts. Before that, I did it with car parts. And now I'm going to be doing that with what I feel is the yen. I feel like buying the yen right now is an absolute bargain. I feel when I compare $1 Aussie and I get over 90 yen for that, that 90 yen just buys me so much more in a country that's extremely clean, extremely safe, and has a great standard of living. Anyway, guys, with that initial talk out of the way, with what we saw as quantitative easing, aka mass easing via governments, we're now going into a different phase where, especially in the US and Australia and the UK, is, as opposed to Japan, Japan's a little bit different. I feel like they're going to try and just keep the cheap money up because there is really not many people borrowing here. But in America, they've got a serious problem where people have definitely borrowed way too much. Australia has this same problem, and I'd say Australia may be even worse than the US in that inflation was extremely bad. Even though the government was reporting some ridiculously low figure of 3%, inflation since 2019 to 2022, prices at the supermarket on average at least went up 25%, and that's a huge number. That's a massive kick for inflation coming in as the average person, especially if you like to save money, you don't like to borrow money. But of course, if you're borrowing money, you're in a much better position because your loans have essentially gotten cheaper. But how long that will be for, nobody knows, because what happens on the other side of the fence after quantitative easing can come quantitative tightening. And basically that means mass tightening, in that they're, instead of printing money and creating money out of thin air, or allowing the consumer to create money after the governments, they can then destroy money. The central banks essentially sell the bonds, or they let them roll off, and that money is then destroyed out of existence. But basically when this happens, it does create So now what does this mean for you as a PC PC tech enthusiast? Well, if you're the PC tech enthusiast that does save some money and you've been waiting to buy PC parts at a cheaper price, all things considered, that's all other things considered, if you've got this cash and production doesn't stop and we don't have any more mishaps, then parts will get cheaper with what's happening with quantitative tightening on the horizon, as well as interest rates going up. Though if anything, the last 2 years have taught us is that this whole thing is an absolute roller coaster ride in predicting what's going to happen in the future. We've seen Shenzhen in China, they've recently shut down due to this sickness, and that does mean an artificial drop in supply. And so if this sickness never came around, production would be at a different level and supply would be at a different level. And so if you coupled that with the reduction in money supply, then you would have cheaper prices naturally. Though one thing with graphics card prices, regardless of Shenzhen, is that there are so many of them out there and they're mining crypto. And so when you have a reduction in money supply, you will naturally see, I believe, crypto prices starting to fall, since this market is heavily leveraged on borrowed money. So if interest rates go up, money supply gets choked, crypto prices will come down naturally, and they may come down dramatically. And so what this means is then you may see a massive amount of GPUs on the market, a flood sale. I'm predicting this to happen sometime around September. That's been my outlook. And so if you wanted to build a gaming PC, I believe September will be the best time to build a gaming PC this year. Though as with anything related to the future, I don't have a crystal ball, but I am starting to analyze this stuff a lot more in depth and relay it to you guys. So hopefully you enjoy these sort of tech and finance videos mixed. I know some people in the comments are telling me you're not an economist, rah, 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 you shouldn't be talking about that. And my reply to that is, well, these lovely economists back in 2020 were saying that there was going to be no inflation. And as we've seen in the last 2 years, inflation has been anything but transitory and low. Unless, of course, you're in Japan. Anyhow, I hope you guys enjoyed today's video. If you did, be sure to hit that like button for us. Also, if you want to see a little tour of the new Tech Yes studio that's being set up in Japan, then I can give you a tour of that, as well as talking about Japanese real estate in general, where I got this apartment here, 3-bedroom apartment, about 40 minutes out from Tokyo. I've now got 1 gigabit per second fiber. So it's absolutely crazy just seeing how fast this internet is compared to Australia, where I'm just watching my videos upload in like 10 seconds in Japan, as opposed to sitting in Australia for hours just waiting for my videos to upload. It's a lot quicker here. And the good thing is about the internet here, it only cost me like USD wise about $30 to $35 a month for unlimited 1 gigabit per second fiber that doesn't throttle either download or upload speeds. But if you guys want to see that happen, I can make a video like that happen for you. And with that aside, thanks for the support. Thanks for watching the vids. And also thanks for commenting all the time. I really appreciate it. It's been a pretty difficult time transitioning from Australia into Japan in the last couple of weeks. I've been prioritizing my son, who I haven't seen in over 2 years. It has just been a relief off my shoulders to be able to see him again, be able to hug him, and just be able to spend time and play Duel Masters, which is his favorite game right now. We've been playing that, been playing some Wii U, Mario 3D, and he's really good at that game. So, and I've been told he shouldn't be getting into gaming, but gaming's in my DNA, and I'm sure it's in at least half his DNA, so that's a pretty good thing. And we've got the question of the day, which comes from Frozen Biscuit, just spelt like Limp Biscuit, but it's frozen instead of limp. And they ask, how many hard-offs were in this video? I'm not sure if this came from a troll account or whatnot, but we went to the PC used junk store. It wasn't PC, sorry. It's just junk stores, and they're called hard-offs in Japan. And there was 3 hard-offs that were in that parts hunt. And unfortunately, they weren't that great. I didn't get any hard-ons. At least for one of the deals, there was a decent deal there with the motherboard, 8 gigabytes RAM, cooler, and that was a decent combo. We picked that up for around 25 USD. But besides that, the hard-offs are kind of falling out of meta, and they are sticking to the name now. And I hope that answers that question. And with that aside, I'll catch you guys in another tech video very soon if you stayed this far. and you want to see the content as soon as it drops, make sure to hit that sub button, ring that bell. Also, if you want some behind the scenes access for as little as $1 a month, you become a member here and hit that join button where you can get some extra behind the scenes footage and me also giving my thoughts and opinions about different things here at Tech Yes City. And with that aside, I'll catch you guys in another tech video very soon. Peace out for now from Japan. Bye.